All right. I'm Michael Strong, co-host of When School's Not Working, where we interview the most amazing human beings who have piloted, or in some cases, developed well beyond piloting incredibly distinctive ways to educate children beyond the mainstream. I'm also the founder of the Socratic Experience, where we help you discover and develop your child's genius. And with that, I'll pass it on to my co-host, Matt Barnes.
Thank you, Michael. Good to see you again. Great to have Dr. Ali-Coleman with us today. I'm Matt Barnes, founder of the Education Game, which is a service to parents to help parents realize what's possible, to understand all the different learning alternatives that are available to them, and to make sure that their children are prepared for the future rather than being prepared for 1985, which is usually the case in most traditional school environments. So Michael, should I go ahead and introduce our guest?
Please.
Great. So we have Dr. Khadijah Ali-Coleman. And so I had a chance to speak with her a few weeks ago, but she is a speaker. We saw her in USA Today and a bunch of different articles. She talks about education, particularly from her lens as the co-founder of the Black Family Homeschool Educator and Scholars, organization. She's an artist, she's an educator, she's a scholar. She studied at Morgan State University, got her PhD, doctorate of education there. She's all over the place online. And so with that brief introduction, there's much more here that I could describe about Dr. Ali-Coleman. Dr. Ali-Coleman, welcome to When School's Not Working.
Oh, this is such a pleasure to be here and to see you again,
yes.
To see Michael. This is so wonderful to be.
Yes. Well, I'm glad that you guys finally get a chance to meet, because you guys, you travel in some, well, you're fighting for similar goals. So let me start, Michael, if I may.
Please.
Because I had the pleasure of, again, speaking with Dr. Ali-Coleman a few weeks ago. We tend to like to hear about the interviewer's learning journey, and I know that yours is a long one, and it curves all over the place.
Yeah.
Can you give us a little bit of that introduction about your own learning journey and kind of what brings you to this point?
Yeah, so I really love how you how you described it. When I think of my learning journey, I think of really the beginning of learning that even existed before schooling for me began. And I know that my parents, even in my naming, it was really significant for my parents to ensure that I had a very strong African centered name, as both of them are Black Americans. My mother passed in 2014, but both of them were I was born in the 70s during, Black Power and all of these things. And so my mother was a young mother. My father had been incarcerated, falsely accused. And so they had been in the justice system, fighting the power. And so I then am born into this this era of resistance. And so very young, I attended the school where my parents went to college, the University of District of Columbia, called Federal City, back in the 70s. And then I later went to a Pan-African school, an independent school in Washington, D.C. called Nation House Watoto Shule, still in existence, 40 some years later. And before then going into public school. And so a lot of my upbringing revolved around learning as a tool, education as a tool of really knowing about self, knowing about history as much as possible, and from both sides, as and not necessarily a Eurocentric type of education that's centered in public schooling, but also finding ways to go about learning. So, you know, the libraries were part of, they were a normalized part, the bookmobile, all these things.
Yes.
So I'm the oldest of 5 children and much older than my siblings. And so my mother homeschooled my brother, who was 11 years younger than me, when in our county in Maryland, it's a lottery system, and they're magnet schools that still exist. And so quotas rule whether or not a certain amount of children of a certain nationality can go to certain schools. And so for my siblings to get into a Montessori program, because my mother was an educator and she taught Montessori when my siblings were really young, but she wanted to get them into the local Montessori school and had to rely on part of our ancestry that is not African American to qualify to get. These are the leaps and the things that we had to do, that my mother had to do to be able to get access to alternatives to traditional public school and to be able to get my siblings into the Montessori program. When my brother aged out after 6th grade, it was an option was private school, but she didn't want him to go into public school. So she decided to homeschool him. And he's the only one out of the 5 of us that was homeschooled. So for me, this was the first time I had ever seen this in action. So if he was, I forget, I was maybe 20, 21. So he was maybe 11. No, he had to be older because this was for middle school. 11's middle school. Yeah. And 12, so, yeah. So I saw it in action, and, you know, it was like, wow. And I swear that was really where I realized that this was something that could happen in our state, in our county, and it stayed with me. And so fast forward almost 10 years later, that definitely was something that was part of all of the possibilities for my daughter, who had this type of schooling, as you described mine as well, where my daughter was, for her 13 years of schooling, was in and out of public private schools as well, in addition to being homeschooled. And we really made decisions based on what we felt was best for our family.
Right, right. Fantastic.
Cool. Well, lots to go into, but I was, we had a little talk before we got on the show. And one of the things that struck, I'm very interested in lineages, and I love your description of, as it were, you're a part of your mother's lineage in terms of alternative educational approaches. But even going to the kind of political thing, we don't want to spend the whole show on this, but in the late 60s and early 70s, the left was often very pro-school choice. Bernie Sanders in like 1975 was pro-school choice. Ivan Illich was kind of a Marxist who was very pro-school choice. And, John Holt kind of identified, there was this, all of this anti-establishment stuff in late 60s, 70s was, hey, we want to do things differently. In San Francisco in the 70s, there were hundreds of tiny, experimental schools going on. And so it's interesting is you kind of, through your mother, carried this through. And yeah.
And I think Matt and I briefly talked about that even before my mother, my great-grandmother. So my great-grandparents are from the South. My great-grandmother's family is from Mississippi, and my great-grandfather's family is from Louisiana. And the two of them met as teachers and they were some of the first Black teachers who began to create Roosevelt schools. Did we talk about this, Mark?
I don't remember that, no.
I'm sorry, because the Roosevelt schools, what folks don't realize is that Roosevelt was a Jewish philanthropist who worked with Booker T. Washington to fund Black schools. And that is where those of us who are in nonprofit and, we get funding, and the whole idea of matched funds comes from Roosevelt schools.
Is that right?
So what Roosevelt would do is, if it was a Black community that wanted a school and they needed funding, they had to demonstrate that there was a demonstrated need. And so they would engage in, churches, they have, fish fries or, anything to raise money. And so those matched funds would then demonstrate to Rosenwald that there was a need, and he would provide the other funding for these schools. And so they helped create dozens of schools throughout Louisiana and Mississippi. And my great grandfather, his name is Ira Andrew Lewis. IA Lewis is a school in Ruston, Louisiana that's named for him. So we have just a history of educators in our family.
And I've never heard of the Roosevelt School. I just pulled it up online, and there were that project built more than 5,000 schools, shops, and teacher homes in the United States, primarily for African-American children in the South. How interesting. Wow. So you have a long history of this, huh?
Yes.
Well, and what that brings up for me, actually, a lot of times we interview people for whom breaking out of the mold was this difficult kind of psychological process because the cultural norm is go to regular school. I'm wondering, because of your background, did you have any, oh no, should I do this or not? Or you had so much confidence from your mom, it's like, of course we do this. Talk a little bit about how unusual it was, or cultural pressures and that kind of thing.
Well, that's an excellent question, because I think as a young person in this the school system, I was very disillusioned with what I saw as being education. I love to learn. I was a voracious reader, so much so that I would get in trouble oftentimes for reading when I'm supposed to be doing chores. I'm in a closet somewhere under the bed reading up at night. So I was just a voracious learner. I was really extra all the time. So you give me an assignment, I'm going to make a musical theatrical presentation with an assignment. And it's like, this is what learning should be, because these are the kinds of things that in my mind, if learning is supposed to be about demonstrating your understanding, then it should be received in any way that, the teacher can see that you synthesize the information, and it shouldn't only have to be regurgitating exactly what they said. And this was early on. And so I had a really, schooling was very disruptive to who I was as an individual. And it was a very uncomfortable space also because of, if you showed a type of agency or expertise or ability in a certain area and not another, it was very hard for them to categorize you. And so that was, the tracking system was very disparate. It was jolting and traumatic for me, because my mother was a mathematician. I was not a mathematician. I was everything. I was an artist. I was a writer. I was, theatrical, all of these things, and, languages, but schools want to track you. And so I had the misfortune of seeing how children that were on the so-called gifted track were treated, and how children who were, as they called in the comprehensive kids, were treated. And I remember being sent to a class where it was straight out of something, those really bad movies where it's the teacher savior, and they're in the hood, saving the children, and the children on the tables dancing and throwing chairs at the teacher. Well, I was sent to a class like this and was like, what in the hot hell is happening? Wow. And I remember asking my mother, I have to go back to because I had been put on this track, because I said I wanted a math class that wasn't as accelerated. And they said, well, if you do that, then all of your classes are going to change. And so I chose to go back to the other track where I was in math. That's when math got away from me that year. So I could do my other classes. And so I wouldn't be in this environment where the teachers really were not engaged with the students.
Yeah. I think your story if we could have honest dialogue with kids in mass, we would hear stories like that about clearly understanding that there's a different type of environment that kids are getting tracked to within the same school. Right? People always talk about, well, this school's good or that school. bad, but within the same school,
within
there are
the
all
same
these different,
school,
all these
exactly.
different
And the
categories.
children know, and they know how when the adults do not care about them, they know when there are no expectations that are had for them. And that was the biggest thing for me, is that there's no expectation, there's no type of expectation of self-policing that you know. And one of the things that I noticed on the other track, kids could be left to do whatever, and they're trusted to do what's right, if that makes any sense. And all of these things you internalize. And talking to homeschooling mothers now, and even with the research, you find that a lot of us who ultimately chose homeschooling, a lot of our decision making revolved around our experiences in the schooling system ourselves.
Right.
Are you saying that by the time you graduated from high school, you knew that you did not want your children back in that system?
Oh my gosh. And I especially did not want them back where I went to school. And that was literally, those were repeated affirmations, is that I do not, if I can help it, if there's anything that I can do, I do not want her to have to come back to the school system that I came out of.
That's interesting, because a lot of people, they will get through it, and almost like, they will they will rationalize it wasn't so bad, and that's what you do, and I made it through, so you've got to make it through too, and without really pausing and saying, is that a place that I actually want my kid to be?
Right.
And just because it's your school from back 20 years ago, you have to really know what to look for. And when you see it in a school, you'll see quickly how chaotic in some cases the environment is, how the expectations are lower for a category of people within that school. Anyway, that's interesting though, that you came away from that environment saying, I'm gonna make sure my kids are not exposed to this environment.
Right. I mean, it was just so many things that I experienced and just witnessed as a young person. And I will say that those experiences actually are what led me to be an educator myself. And in my early work, even before being, teaching college, it was one of my first jobs in my 20s, right out of school, was a case management and working with children, so-called at risk, but really children who were disconnected from the school system. And a lot of people, because the stereotypes people have of Black people who can speak is that you must have had this pristine upbringing, that you can't relate to me. And then so it would always be that shock when talking with young people, that what my experiences were in the school system, and how I just really was not my brilliance was not supported. And I say my brilliance is meaning, I think all children have brilliance, that and as educators, that is what our magic power is unleashing this brilliance. And it's so unique to every young person. And I recognize that I was not treated with care in the presence of adults. And that's something, I think that is probably one of the biggest letdowns of these environments, is that there's so many excuses, the bureaucracy, I have to do this, but just that, as a human person choosing to be an educator, you need to first understand, regardless of who you are reporting to, that you have this opportunity to unleash the brilliance of a young person who is looking at you to set the tone and the culture of this space in which they're in. And so many educators do not hone this skill well at all. And it's not something where, oh, well, I didn't do it. When you don't get it right that 1 year, that's a lifetime for a young person. And that is imprinting them for them to carry it on. I am 47 years old, and I still can remember specific instances where adults not only did not choose to treat me with care, but chose violence, whether it was in the hostility and aggressiveness in which they interacted with me, or looking the other way when seeing something take place in interactions. And those things matter. Yeah. And we don't talk about that. That cultivation of space is very pivotal, is very powerful. Sure. And so when we even talk about homeschooling, that's one of the major things that we converse about with parents, is the ability to curate this learning experience where children gravitate toward learning rather than trudge through it or still exist despite. You know, right. the worst thing is to be able to survive despite. And your right. schooling experience should never be an obstacle that you trudged through, you know.
Right. Michael?
Yeah, no, a lot. So first of all, although in some ways I'm all over the place, I also have a linear thread. And so right now I'm fascinated by the, okay, at 18, you know that school is not the right pathway. And at some point, you know, you became, I think of you as the head of the leader of the Black homeschooling movement.
Oh, wow.
So what happened between there? I mean, was it kind of a gradual process, or you mentioned a role as an educator? I'm just curious, kind of, you know, ABC, what happened in between?
So I want to be clear that you know, Black homeschooling has been taking place, has been happening for decades, right? And for many Black people, Black parents, Black mothers in particular, who have chosen to homeschool, before now, it's, you know, it's the big thing because of COVID. But many chose really to be on the fringes and to not really be forthcoming with this, choosing this as a practice, because of the history of how the relationship of Black people to education in this country. And yes. Our education processes have always been politicized, right? One of the biggest fears now is that now everybody knows about it. What's going to happen next, right?
Right.
So I will say that my daughter, so I had my daughter 2003, she was born during Hurricane Isabel. That's a whole other story, right? And so I was just about to turn 30, and you know, she immediately was, you know, I realized very early on that even when she was born, how unnatural it was to have to send my child somewhere after 3 months that I had. And so I will say that that was hard for me in general. It's like, I just gave birth to someone that I now must put in a childcare center so that I can work and stuff like that. And so, you know, she went to a daycare, she went to preschool. So we were living in Baltimore at the time, and came back to the area where we live now. And she was too young to go to public school, you know, because kindergarten, she had done preschool, but she was 4 and you had to start kindergarten at 5. Mm-hmm. And so unless you take this test, so they had this test where the parents are not allowed to in the room, they take your child, you don't know what's on it because they don't want you to prep your child or anything. And so she came out and she was smiling and they were like, she did not pass, right? so I was like, okay. And she stayed with me. So that was the beginning of us homeschooling. So I did so many crazy jobs to be able to stay with her until she went into the public school system. And then after, at 4th grade, as I was telling Matt, the teacher, so when she started school, she tested well. They tested her as gifted and talented, what have you. The teacher called me in 4th grade and was like, we need you to talk with her. And it's like, oh my God, what does she do? And she finishes before everyone else. And then when she finishes, she pulls out a journal and starts writing. And I don't give her permission to do that. So I need for you to talk to her about this because it's disruptive to the other children around, because then they want to write too.
What a crime.
And so I was like, what?
To be nice.
And so other conversation came out of this. Ultimately, the teacher asking me to come in and do some writing workshop with whatever. And so I knew then that we were going to be homeschooling. So we
Yeah.
homeschooled for 5th and 6th grade. She decided in 6th grade she wanted a career as a YouTuber. So my whole thing with homeschooling her, because she was 10 at this time, I was like, well, what are some things that YouTubers need to do to prepare? And she was like, you know, public speaking maybe, and she named some other things. There was a local school that was auditioning for performance arts. It was a performance arts school that was auditioning for new students. I told her, why don't you try auditioning to just see what it felt like being in front of people, what have you. She aced the audition. She was amazing. And she said, I think I might want to go to this school. So she went to a performance arts school for 7th and 8th. And then even though she got into a couple of programs for high school for performing arts, she asked me, she said, can you homeschool me for high school? And I said, absolutely. And that is what she did. I just graduated her this past May. Yeah. And she now is and she got an associate's degree also, because she started taking community college classes her what would be her freshman year in high school as a homeschooler. And so she's now at the University of San Francisco.
Nice,
cool.
Nice. One of the things I remember talking with you about a couple of weeks ago, Dr. Ali-Coleman, was that you were describing how this idea of leaving the system of homeschooling or home learning is not something that is a one decision and you're out for good.
Right.
You can go back and forth. You
Yep.
can follow the needs of your child depending on what's going on in that moment. And
Yep.
so in your child's example, she wanted to go in, she wanted to leave, you were insisting on one direction, right? That is a much more natural environment because every year your children are changing so much.
Yep.
Right? They may need a different dynamic,
Yep.
or your family may need a different dynamic. And so I want to make sure that listeners understand that back and forth is normal.
Yep.
And you can always re-enter, you can always exit. It's actually not as hard as it might be. It might sound.
Yeah. And cultivating, one of the things that was always of importance to me was cultivating self-knowing in my daughter, like just being able, like we talk about intuition, trusting your instinct, trusting your intuition, but that really, any behavior is really about repeated practice. And so you can't just tell another person, trust your instincts, without demonstrating what does that look like. And so for us, a lot of our conversations, a lot of our homeschool practice really revolved around how do things feel, comparison of experiences and things like that. And for her, you know, what I believe the decision to want to homeschool for high school is that she had this experience now returning to middle school, seeing what some of the experiences were like, and understanding that for high school, you know, I want to have some autonomy. I want to have some more agency that did not exist in middle school. And that's actually, I learned more about the story actually during a teaching that I had last year for the Black Family Homeschool Scholars and Educators. Our teaching, I actually interviewed her, and I didn't realize just how many issues that she had with her traditional schooling experience from middle school around, you know, everything from not being able to wear a head wrap, to having certain things just be adultist for no reason, and that even being the language that she used. And so wanting to have a high school experience that wasn't just marred with so much control and rules, when she could really just have the flexibility to engage in learning in a self-paced type of way.
Nice.
So again, I get you got a huge amount from your mother and your own experiences when you were young. And then I get with your daughter, you have a lot of the parents, and give credit mostly to moms who come on our show, totally have this intuition that this is, you know, this is what my child needs. In the intervening years, when you were maybe in kind of professional environments or formal educational systems, were you kind of always thinking about these issues, or you just, okay.
Yeah. I worked at Covenant House, Washington from 2001 to 2006 in Washington, D.C. And for anyone who's familiar with Covenant House, Washington, the primary population in which they serve are 16 to 24-year-olds who are considered homeless or at risk. And homeless could be children who are couch surfing. So they may be staying from friend to friend or relative to relative. And so I worked for a program with Covenant House that was a prevention program. So the children that we worked with were between the ages of 11 to 17, that middle school to high school age, and engaging them in ways that they wouldn't become this population that Covenant House serves in general. And so one of the things that I worked there at the time where Vincent Gray, who was former mayor of DC, he was the executive director. And one of the things that he made all of us get trained in was advancing youth development theory, AYD. And I have to say that that was one of the most transformative trainings I've ever had, because it gave language to a lot of the beliefs that I have around working with young people and about education in general. And one of the things, though, even the term adultist is what's inherent in this theory, but one of the things that they recognize is that youth development is something that's always happening. And so the goal for educators should be positive youth development. And that's where we as educators and youth workers come in, is that we are enhancing that experience for young people where their youth development pathway is one where positive youth development is happening. And so recognizing that whenever we have an opportunity that we want for young people, that our job is to see if the services and supports are in place for that opportunity to be recognized. And also requires competencies that we have as youth workers and educators when working with young people. And so this, I would say, so I was trained in maybe a year or two after I had my daughter. This is what I'm learning at work. And this is like, this is the language. This is how I feel about education. And so yes, in answer to your question, Michael, I've always felt really passionate and very strong about just learning, it being possible for folks, for young people to love learning, and for it to be something that could be curated uniquely to who the child is. And that's, even if you have a group of people, that there's certain things that can be specific to the individual.
Right. And so when you're that, I can see how that would shape you, because it gave you new language to think about your child. So when did you first start spinning up? I'm eager to get to this transition into this homeschool leader, this kind of person that's being interviewed all the time. And when did that idea that essentially you're trying to help other people go through the experience you went through already, when did that start to cross into your mind as something that you could actually start to lean in and build and support?
I'm a community organizer. That's what I do. I have my arts organization, Liberated Muse Arts Group, started as a digital community in 2008. There's something, someone told me, and I forget what his exact words were, but it just resonated with me so much, where he said that one of the things that he liked about me and he found admirable was that I share my life with everyone. So everything that is of importance to me, I built community around it. It was something to that effect.
Interesting.
And for me, I feel that is part of my lineage. That is what I do. And community organizing, building community is a natural thing that I do. And so I decided, so I started graduate school, my doctoral program in 2016, decided on my dissertation topic, maybe 2 years into the program, mainly wanting to connect. So my program's community college leadership. It's higher ed with the emphasis on community college leadership. I've taught college for about 10 years and been in higher ed off and on for maybe 20 years. But I wanted to particularly look at dual enrolled African-American homeschool students, because I had a lot of dual enrolled students in my classes. I know, had homeschoolers, and this was really these two populations of Black dual enrolled and homeschoolers, very little research done in the literature, but also the schools themselves don't touch it. Like they're not on the same page with how to outreach to these populations, what to do with them, right?
Right.
And then when you think of homeschool, everyone always thinking the crazy cult kids, right? So I really wanted to contribute to the research on this group, because this was part of my culture, of this is a culture that I'm in. And so I had pushback from people at my school, advisors, what have you, like, what? Because this is something they're totally ignorant on and can't have an opinion on, because this is something they're not familiar with.
Right.
And so, but I still wanted to do it. So I defended my dissertation last year, March 13th. And if you recall, that quarantine was March 16th.
Right.
And so I had to do it virtually because my campus was closed on March 13th, Friday the 13th. And after that, the closings, everything, homeschooling became what everyone was talking about. And so my name got passed around because folks knew that I had been homeschooling for a while.
Yeah, and researching.
And so, and then it's like, oh, and you studied this. This is part of your dissertation. So that is how. So I actually got offered a book publishing opportunity before I graduated in May. And I decided to invite Dr. Cheryl Field Smith, who is actually the most prolific writer on Black homeschooling. If you Google anything on Black homeschooling, her name will come up in terms of the literature. She just published a book last year on single mothers who homeschool. And so she agreed to co-edit this book because I didn't want to do my dissertation first. I wanted to do something with many voices because the literature is just so lacking when it comes to Black homeschooling. And so together we'd start talking how we wanted a way to connect research with practitioners. And so then I was like, well, it's only on word. And so I said, we can have what's called a teach-in. I've participated in a couple of teach-ins before, rather than a conference, because teach-ins really also are mobilizing folks toward public action, right? And so I'm thinking if we do this enough, we can start getting folks to think not only as practitioners, but also as policymakers. And so we started the Facebook group to kind of just build community around that, and had our first teach-in last July. We had our second one this past July. And that's really the genesis of the community, but the work, we really are intentional about this piece, this educational research piece. And I'm very passionate about, I want to arm parents, and that just, I don't like that word arming because it's like weaponizing, but I really do think it's important that homeschooling parents are also aware of the policies that exist. And I don't want us to continue to be victimized or, with policy, but be be a part of the building of policy.
Sure.
So I'm very curious about that piece. Some states have legislation, I don't know the details, you probably know better than I, that allows homeschoolers to get some funds from the state for homeschooling. Can you talk a little bit about what kinds of programs like that you're in favor for, and if you're against any, what you're against and why? Just give your perspective on those kinds of policies.
Well, it's so interesting because anyone who is interested in homeschooling, you need to first start with what the policies are in your state. All of our states have different policies on what homeschooling is and how you can go about. And there's some states where it's very lenient, where you just take your child out of the school formally and then you homeschooling, right? Whereas a state where Maryland, what we had to do was unenroll her from the school, but then you had to also do an intent to homeschool form. And you're really just keeping that ID number that the child has, that they would have been given or are given, their school ID, because it's tracking. So it's still tracking that's taking place, whereas that's not in every state. You have states like California where you literally have to be associated with a school or create a school in order to be a formal homeschooling entity. You have some states that require parents to have certain credentials, whether it's a high school diploma or college diploma. So all of the states are different in some way. So that is always the first step. And so there are organizations like HSLDA is the organization that nationally has really been the force behind a lot of the policy that we do know about homeschooling. And they are the vanguard of educational freedom when it comes to homeschooling, and really adamant about this whole idea that homeschoolers they are against the state giving money for the most part, because with money comes oversight. And for those of us who are really, I'm not going to say hardcore, it sounds like a gang, right? But veterans, veteran homeschoolers know that oversight is a very serious thing, because while it seems on face value that it's about ensuring that abuses are not taking place, it also begins to infuse the experience with a lot of those things that were the reason why families decided to homeschool in the first place.
Right.
And so that is always that fine line that we're trying to navigate during, particularly those who are paying attention to what's happening. And you can look at what's happening in this country and even looking at what's happening globally, because this is not something that is only happening in the United States. And in fact, I would even venture to say that what is happening globally is used as an excuse for some of the policies and laws that some states take on, particularly if you look at countries where, everyone's seen those memes that float through Facebook about European schools where, all these wonderful things that are happening in the schools, where some of those states have banned homeschooling and homeschooling isn't allowed. So, I just think it's so important when we talk about policy to be knowledgeable of all of those things, particularly if this is a practice that you plan on engaging in. It's not just, not just tunnel vision and what's working for knowing what's happening in the world, because anything could change overnight.
Yeah. Although I'd like to hear, I know I have my own core reasons of why homeschooling should be allowed, and not only allowed, but encouraged. What would you say is if you could distill it into one, maybe two core reasons of why homeschooling makes sense or should be encouraged or allowed? What would you say that is?
Well, I know my family, we were so homeschooling was an exhale. That's what I just did, was an exhale. I wasn't trying to be dramatic, but it really was. There was I can't even explain to you, when she asked me to return to homeschooling for high school, it was just, we had been through some stuff for middle school, just so many things. And a lot of those things had absolutely nothing to do with learning, and being able to have ownership of this learning experience for her, especially for high school, was such an enriching life experience, because learning happened at every single moment. And learning is not linear. It's not. And so I feel that it's an experience that has really enriched our relationship with each other. And just, she's at college now, living her best life. If we get a call, before I jumped on this call, I was just telling her father, I was like, my daughter is living her best life. Did you talk to her today? He was like, no, and she'll pop, she'll FaceTime us or what have you. But she was really able to just develop so much self-awareness and just certain things, because she wasn't rushed.
Mm,
You know, she had the ability to
good space.
self-pace,
Yeah.
to find the things that she enjoys. And so she went to college as not an empty vessel trying to fit. She went to college with some ideas on how she was going to show up. And
Yeah.
that's magical.
Yeah.
So beautifully, beautifully said. I want to just push one more on the money thing. I'm acutely aware, Germany, homeschool is illegal, and I'm acutely aware of the strings attached with funding. It's really scary. And, I've talked to Matt about this. In New York City, they spend $30,000 per pupil. So, should we only let parents homeschool who can one way or another afford it without external funds? And maybe it's total, you're a community organizer. What if we could unleash even a portion, but 30,000 a kid, a family of four would have $120,000 to educate their kids. Oh my gosh, what could you do? So so maybe I'll put it this way, as a community organizer, do you think it's possible we could create a movement to respect parents more and give parents more authentic autonomy if some of the funds did go to the parents? Or is that just hopeless?
I think that there's so many ideas connected to. I have never been one to equate funding with effectiveness. I mean, it's never proven to be factual or actual in any realm that I've worked in. I've worked in nonprofit, higher education. I've been in public schools. I actually was an instructional media specialist, which is a fancy word of saying librarian. And so I've never seen where money guaranteed that you would have quality instruction and that you would have quality instructors, because it's all based, the decision making is on how that money is spent revolves around certain people, and those people may not be on the same page as you. And so I'm aware that, especially now, there's so many folks that are showing up I want to homeschool now, really with their only idea of schooling is what they've seen modeled in traditional schooling. So I will tell you, every week in the group that I moderate on Facebook, it's conversations with new homeschoolers and veteran homeschoolers with the resounding affirmation: you do not have to replicate traditional schooling in your home. You do not have to replicate. So I say that to say that many of them start off buying the desks, buying the chalkboards, everything, literally setting up a classroom for their one or two children in their house until after, it's like, this ain't working. This is not. And I will say that for me, the regular things that we did, I have the luxury of living in the Washington, D.C. area. So we live with Smithsonian museums.
Oh, yeah.
So they're free, but libraries were places we even would travel to, like Florida, and, go to the beach or somewhere. That was fancy, going to Florida, right? And then visit. So every state we go, visit the library. Go to parks and all of these places that did not require admission. And even when it came to me choosing jobs or having side hustles, I think I was telling Matt that I would perform at places where I may not have been able to afford the admission ticket. So I would perform or barter so that I could, at least this could be a field trip for my daughter. So a lot of the my creative skills were around curating this learning experience that wasn't reliant on money. It was really about experiences. And that's what they say about, I'm not a millennial, I'm much older than millennials, but that's what, when millennials are described, they're described as being more concerned about, and that's why they may leave a job easier, is because they're about experiences. And I love that, because that explains the homeschooling journey so much. It's about what type of experience are you curating?
Yeah. Well, and just Michael, I'll take a stab at your question about this money thing. To me, my dominant theory is that God gave that child to that parent. And therefore that parent is the dominant responsible party. And as such, that responsible party should have decision making. And if they don't understand how to make decisions, then people like Dr. Ali-Coleman or yourself or myself or others can maybe help. But they are the decider. That's how I approach this. And I'm waiting for somebody to challenge me on that, because I'm going to take them apart.
That's right.
So this is where, Matt, you said you wanted to get into the political side of this, but this is tricky. Again, in some ways, there are many of us who have just left the system and okay, let it go on. We do our thing, they do their thing, no problem. And I guess we just, what I'm hearing from both of you is let's just accept it's an incredible, I would say, waste of money that damages a lot of kids. Like, oh, well, but it kills me,
Well, just let me be clear. I think that if they're the decision makers, then they should have the ability to decide how to use the resources. That's where I come down. And I know that gets into politics, but again, if someone is making the decision for my child and they don't have to suffer the results of bad choices, then that's actually disempowering me. And the last thing I want anybody to do is disempower me when it's related to something that's the most important, prized possession of my life. So I'll step down from my.
I want the two of you to create a grassroots movement. And I know you're already halfway there, Khadijah, but I mean a serious grassroots movement. How do we amplify this tenfold?
Well, I'm working on something right now where I really am trying to gather homeschooling mothers and really have some education around policy. So I'm really big with matching practice with policy and research. I think that those three things are very important and go hand in hand. And I think for so long it's been by design that they're so disparate, that even when, if in case you didn't know, like in academia, it's everything is so political and just so hoity-toity. But even the idea of me getting a doctor of education as opposed to a philosophy, a PhD,
yeah,
that's in academia, my doctorate is looked at as being more a practitioner as opposed to research. Well, I do research, but I never want to be disconnected from being a practitioner. That is a badge of honor for me. And for so long, there's research that has occurred in the academy that practitioners don't know anything about. And you have all this research that's not applied at all. And so I really am about organizing around, so folks who may not have a degree, I still want them to be knowledgeable on how to access research, how to access these so-called best practices, and for our voices to really be inherent, because this research is also a documentation. I'm really big with museums as well. And so a lot of these stories and these experiences need to be documented. And that's what we're doing with YouTube, believe it or not, is that we are creating a living a record of what has come before. And so I'm really for homeschooling parents to talk about their practice and what has worked for them, so that we can have this living record, and so that this can begin to inform policy, and that we are not just victimized essentially by policies that impact us. And I think for me, pulling my child out of compulsory school and homeschooling her was my decision, not for her to be an experiment. And that is because, as you said at the top of this hour, Matt, about how 1980 education is teaching for 1985, is that it is a fact that a lot of the practices and the things that children are taught are not for today. And that's because the people teaching went to school
back in 1985.
Right.
Exactly,
and are still reliant on what they learned back in their day. And unless it is, depend on who they are as a person or what their supervising staff said, them being up to date on their skill set, it's a luck of the draw, right? Yes. And so for me, I wanted homeschooling, that learning experience, and really to get to a place where she is self-directed in that practice, so that she will forever be current and it's not reliant on where I was. but also realizing that as a homeschooling parent, I'm also learning as well. And that I must be open to receive the messages that I'm being taught from this process as
Yes,
well.
yes, yes. Preach.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I wonder if we just should let you imagine you mentioned a book, you've mentioned a Facebook group. You want to talk a little bit about the resources you have for
Yeah,
parents?
yeah.
Sure. So we have a Facebook group, Black Family Homeschool Educators and Scholars Resource Group. And that's funny in itself because when your groups grow, it can get unwieldy. And so I've had a lot of folks join the group who are not homeschooling parents who are trying to pitch, because this is a new ecosystem that's growing. So you
Yes.
have what the media is not talking about is, I know they'll talk about the bus drivers not showing up for schools, but they're not talking about the teachers who are leaving in flocks, right?
Oh my
And you know where
gosh.
they're coming? They're coming to groups like mine, trying to pitch their services to teach to parents who are deciding to homeschool. And so, what is that to say about our culture? What is our culture becoming now as a homeschooling culture where so many people are trying to enter it to really replicate this traditional schooling system? So that in itself has just been very, I don't know how to even express how I feel about it, because it's like watching, this is not, I never want to be those people that say, well, back in my day, this isn't how I homeschool. I don't want to be
Right.
that person, but it's kind of devastating to see how it's just this flocking to really capitalize off of this,
Yeah, yeah.
And so, but that is a space. So, I have rules now on Fridays. Folks can pitch their services or what have you, but it really is meant to be a place where homeschooling families can meet each other, where we can share research, we can share news on homeschooling. We also have the teaching. We're starting to have events again. Last year, Cheryl and I started a Tea Talk series where we would have panels where homeschooling parents would talk and share their tips. And we also have a book that's coming out this year, Homeschooling Black Children in the U.S., Theory, Practice, and Popular Culture. And Information Age Publishing is putting that out. And once I get a date, I'll let you know, but you can learn more, all of that at blackfamilyhomeschool.org.
Got it. Got it. Just to repeat, so I heard Black Family Homeschooling Educators and Scholars, right?
Black Family Homeschool Educators and Scholars. Yes.
Homeschool Educators and Scholars. That's your Facebook page. And then the website, blackfamilyhomeschoolers.org.
blackfamilyhomeschool.org.
Sorry.
That's okay.
I abbreviated it and then misread it. So, okay, blackfamilyhomeschool.org.
Yes, sir.
Got it. Got it. And then this book, I'm really, really interested in this book, Homeschooling Black Children in the U.S. You know what? Let's take do we have, I'm not sure if we have the time for this, Michael, but maybe 30 seconds, Dr. Ali-Coleman, and describe why there's a specific focus on Black learners and Black students in this homeschool space.
Well, there's so many, there's diversity in the stories that are featured in this book, but it's very necessary to know that the reasons vary why Black families choose to homeschool. And it's also important for folks to know that the process that led, so many of the questions that you all asked me today, that process may be completely different for another family. And so all of those narratives are combined into this volume and really speak to the diversity of our community and the ways that homeschooling has really impacted the lives of homeschooled children. We also have someone in the book who was homeschooled themselves, who now is homeschooling her son. And so those types of stories are really important for folks to know that things are possible, but also for us to have historical record of this culture.
Nice, nice.
So cool. Well, we'll have to revive the show just to have you back on.
Oh, it was a pleasure. It went so fast.
Always does. Yes.
Yeah.
And I so appreciate, Michael, I'll just tell you, we just scratched the surface because my conversation with her a couple of weeks ago went into a whole bunch of different directions.
Yes,
And
it
so
did.
love to have you back at some point if we continue this thing. So
Oh,
thank you so
definitely.
much.
Thank you. And thank you for all the great work that you two are doing with really just illuminating the different options that we have for our children and our grandchildren to come. And so this is
Amen.
really great work. So I thank you
Amen.
both.
Well, thank you. And I'll reach back out because I definitely want to keep talking to you.
Yay.
So this is Michael Strong with When School's Not Working. And thank you so much for joining us this evening. Till next week. Bye-bye.